Hi, everyone, and
Hi.
welcome to this panel discussion about what works and what doesn't work in this area of inclusion and anti-discrimination work. My name is Elin Ferm, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm the co-founder of the Norm Critical Consulting Bureau, Norm. And we work just like my colleagues here on the panel in the field that in corporate language is sometimes referred to as diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we help organizations turn a critical eye on themselves and develop more representative and inclusive work environments. And this work holds a lot of challenges as well as possibilities. And although I love reading and exploring critical theory that moves in this context, I sometimes find it difficult or challenging to bridge this gap between theory and practice. And that is why I have invited this brilliant panel that you can see. They work in the same field as me, and they're here to join the conversation, also because I think that together we can come up with interesting conversations and solutions, and more brains work better than one. So my aim for us today is to think together, and that we can use this space to exchange ideas and hopefully learn from and with each other. And this beautiful panel will get a chance to introduce themselves in a minute. But first, I just want to tell you a little bit about the framework and the structure of the following hour. It seems that we have everyone on board now, which is nice. And the focus for this talk is LGBTQ plus workplace inclusion. And obviously, we all know that discrimination is not limited to just the workplace, but that will be the framework for this conversation today. And as all of us on this panel work from a perspective that acknowledges that the ways in which various forms of inequality often operate together, that's also where we'll be speaking from today, meaning that we will talk about inclusion work in LGBTQ plus rights, also in terms of, for example, class and race. And as you can see, we're doing this online with the help from a professional company that Copenhagen Pride has hired, and there'll be live editing, which makes it a lot more exciting to watch than a Zoom meeting. But that also means that I'm going to be directing the panel a little bit more than if we were in the same room and could kind of sense each other and just jump in. And in terms of the structure, after the introductions, we'll go on to discuss the challenges and possibilities with this type of work that we do. And as we speak, you as in the audience, will be able to send in questions to the panel online. So you can either comment on the live stream on Facebook, or you can send in this via an email on this debate@copenhagenpride.dk. And that's the Danish debate without the E on the end. So if you want your questions to be anonymous as well, you can use the email. And if you have a question directed at a particular panelist, make sure to include that in your email or your comment. So then we'll end the conversation with your questions. Cool. So let's start with a quick round of introductions of the panel. We're going to do this in alphabetical order as well. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself with name, pronouns, title, and also your motivation for being here today. Alex, would you like to start? Oh, I can't seem to hear you. Maybe there's something wrong with the sound. Can we try? Nope. Still can't hear you. Headphones? Do you have any nearby? Cool. Maybe Bontu can go whilst Alex is doing the headphones. Yes. Bontu,
yes.
Do you want to continue?
Does it work here?
Yes.
Super. Fantastic. Thank you, Elin, for the invite. I'm super excited to be here with all of you. My name is Bontu Lucy Gushke. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm a PhD fellow at Copenhagen Business School at the Department of Organization and also the Diversity and Difference platform. And I guess what brings me here is very much related to the research I do in my PhD. I investigate workplace harassment and discrimination from an anti-racist and queer feminist perspective. So I'm trying to understand how different forms of racist, sexist, anti-queer discriminations interlink and how they're reproduced in the norms and in the normative settings of organizations. And that's what brings me here today. I think it's so important that we start or continue questioning beyond ideas of inclusion of minoritized and marginalized groups, and start really questioning those norms and the basis upon which they're built and why they're being reproduced. And those, of course, quite big questions. I'm super happy to discuss them with you today.
Thank you. Rike, do you want to continue? No? Okay. Maybe we'll jump back to Alex. How's the sound going over there? Yeah. Maybe we should add just before this that we haven't had a chance to sound test before this. This is why this is happening. But let's try and work it out. How's your sound working, Alex? No, I still can't hear anything. For a second there, I thought I heard something, but yeah. Okay. Sabrina, do you want to try?
Sure thing. I'm a bit afraid that you might hear too much, so I try to mute my mic because I have a small kiddo right next to me. But anyway, my name is Sabrina, and I've done some research in representational matters, specifically in the representation of the marginalized of society, which is, of course, both the queer community. It can be people marginalized due to racism or other structural discrimination forms. I now mostly work as a consultant, and I actually don't know the right proper English term for foredragsholder. I do talks, I guess, that people pay for. And maybe I should mention my pronouns are she and her. I look very much forward to be part of this debate because I have both been working as a diversity consultant on one hand and as a researcher on the other. And I struggle the same way that you described in the beginning, Elin, that sometimes they point in completely opposite directions. But I find it so fruitful and interesting to try to figure out how they can complement each other. And I look very much forward to you guys helping with that.
Super, thank you. Should we try Alex again? Alex has got some new headphones, yeah? Nope, still not working. Maybe if you restart your computer, if you attach your headphones at the very start, it should be able to work. We'll try that. Yeah, sorry about this. Rike, are you on board? Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah, you go.
Yay. Hi, I'm Rikke Olesen. I'm the founder of Work, a consultancy company that helps workplaces build more equality. My pronouns are her and she. I identify as a non-heterosexual woman, and I'm really excited to be here today and discuss these interesting and important questions with all of you clever people.
Great, thank you. And then we'll try Tess. Tess, are you on board? 2 seconds. Let's see.
I'm on board now. Sorry, my phone suddenly also jumped on the stream, so I could hear you both talking on top of each other. There's a lot of technical issues today. Sorry.
Yeah.
So my name is Tess Skadegaard Thorsen. I am a researcher primarily, so I'm probably going to have a little bit less to say about what works today in terms of consultancy, and a little bit more about what doesn't work. My research and my PhD, which I finished last year, centers on representation in the Danish film industry, and I especially look at what goes wrong with different forms of diversity initiatives, inclusion initiatives, and other sort of efforts to increase diversity. So part of what I want to look closer at is what happens when we talk about inclusion, diversity, and equity as sort of the goal. So I'm very happy to be invited as well to to sort of critically question some of these things. And I use the pronouns she, her.
Thank you. And Alex, are you on board?
We'll see. Can you hear me now?
Yay, fantastic. There you are.
Okay.
Great.
Third time a charm. Hello, my name is Alex Dillamar. I primarily use the pronouns they, them, while sometimes using he, him as well. I am a project manager at LGBT plus Denmark, where I work with trans rights. I've been doing that for about 2 years, and before that I studied anthropology. And I wrote my master's about coexisting trans narratives. So within the trans, queer, and non-binary community in Montreal. So my work has primarily revolved around people who are not cisgendered or who question their gender, and trying to figure out ways to include trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people into the work that is done for them and about them. Yeah.
Super, thank you. And you in the audience, as you can see, it's a brilliant panel that we have with us today, and I'm very excited that they've all agreed to join. And let's hope that we can continue this without too much technical problems. We could also say that it's the first talk of this Pride Week, so we're kind of getting to test things out as well. But I figured we'd start this discussion by looking closer at the terminology that is surrounding this field that we work in. And I know that you, Tess, are not a super fan of these terms, diversity, inclusion, and equity. Could you maybe expand on this a little bit?
Absolutely. So I have issues with all of the terminology of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, which is often confusing since I do some consultancy, and my clients usually come to me with questions about exactly this kind of work. The challenge with diversity, I think, linguistically, or if we look at it from a research perspective, is it sets us up with a goal that only requires that we look to maintaining or achieving a certain level of difference. So diversity basically is a stand-in word for the presence of difference. And that, I think, is a relatively low bar to set for this type of work. Usually there can be a very high level of diversity in an organization or in a business and still be very high levels of discrimination and hate and unequal treatment. And that's kind of where I take issue with the terminology of diversity. And the same kind of goes with equity and inclusion. Take a word like inclusion. It's often based around or founded on this idea that somebody with power includes somebody else through their benevolence or goodwill. So it sort of maintains that same norm, that same power structure that we've been setting out to question and critique with this type of work before. So part of the reason why I take a little bit of pause at using the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion in my own work is because I find that they're used as cover terms or decorative terms that can distract us from talking about discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. So I feel like oftentimes we mention stuff that's comfortable or pleasant, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we can all agree that that sounds kind of harmless and nice, but we forget to talk about the more severe issues.
Yeah. And so just to follow up on that, when you work with these clients that come to you with these terms, do you then direct them to use other types of terms, or what would you use instead?
I spend a lot of time negotiating language with my clients, and oftentimes they get this point pretty quickly. After a workshop or two, it becomes pretty obvious that a lot of this language provides us with a lot of fluff. I actually make the same critique about bias training as well. We're all happy hearing that we all have biases. That way we don't have to blame anyone and we can all be responsible. So I find it very important to not just talk about bias, but to talk about power. And I find that usually when I redirect our attention to discrimination, racism, sexism, and oppression, my clients are pretty happy doing so, and if not, I'm in a fortunate position as a researcher that I can choose who I want to work with.
Nice. Sabrina, I know that we've previously spoken about this in terms of language as well, in terms, and So the pros and cons of using what you could call like the accepted language of the organization to also get in to then do the work. So maybe like a Trojan horse or something like this. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this terminology section?
Yeah, definitely. Like you mentioned, Elin, not using the word Trojan horse, even though it's more descriptive. I'm very inspired by parasitic feminism, which is the idea that if you, like a parasite, can infiltrate the enemy, maybe you can bring in something they didn't expect, and that way surprise them and broaden their horizons. So I actually do quite a lot of anti-bias trainings and a lot of talks on how biases work. But I never do so without speaking of privileges, for example, or larger discrimination structures or marginalization structures, getting history into the picture, or getting to talk about norms and how norms somehow make some of us more normal than others, and what kind of power that comes with that position. So why I definitely start making the point test just mention about biases being something that influences all of us in somehow, then I also try to get in there how privileges work and how power works, and how the broadest shoulder should, of course, carry the biggest load. So I often talk about who has the most homework after such a workshop. And people, well, let me say, some clients get a bit surprised by it because they hope for a happy ending. But I find that often it's very productive, actually, to start slow in a terminology they know and then build upon it.
Okay. So would you change the wording as well as you go, or do you stick with these terms throughout and build underneath, Sabrina?
I must admit I stick with the terms, because I find one of the hardest problems, both in my own research and doing consultancy work, is actually to just get the conversation going. I've done some research on Danish institutions, and what I found out was they had the hardest time even talking with me, because they didn't know what words to use. And they were constantly trying to see, did I maybe say something, give something away they could mirror? Because then they could use that term as a safe language. And I don't believe the safe language exists as of now. I hope that somehow it will come into fruition when the world gets less problematic somehow. But right now I start on a language that most people know, in order to also be inclusive in that manner, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that is a challenge of the field that we're moving in as well. And we'll come back to this idea of also what works and later in the discussion. But I also thought in the event description, we've mentioned this thing that some scholars like Sarah Ahmed, for example, argue that diversity policies can in fact end up concealing the very inequalities that they were meant to reveal. And then her work also explores how diversity work is sometimes used by institutions as a performance or a sort of box to tick to avoid doing the actual work, much in line with what Tess mentioned as well. And I thought I'd turn to you, Bontu, to ask, because you've also been investigating harassment and discrimination in organizations. Is this box ticking something that you've seen in your work as well?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned the example of Ahmed and what she talks about in terms of policy being used or misused, I think that's a really important point, because what we see in organizations sometimes is that it is rather easy to write a policy that says we have zero tolerance for any forms of discrimination, but that then it's actually thought that the mere act of saying that or of writing that into a policy is enough to actually create change. And that alone will then kind of magically lead to discrimination to disappear. And I think a really important point that Ahmed also highlights is that it's not only that those policies and those documents where we write that down, then sometimes kind of they don't do what they promise. But she introduces this term of non-performativity, so that these policies actually prevent further action. Because what happens is that, you write a policy and then you can pride yourself in, we have done something. We have acted. We have written a policy. Maybe you even get, a new diversity label for having written a really nice policy. And then that can be used as an argument for, we don't need to do something about this problem. because we have already written a policy. And that's, I think, where it becomes problematic if the policy is kind of equated with action being taken. So again, to, what words do we use and what do they mean and what action do they trigger? I guess also with documents and policies, we really have to question how do we formulate them and to what extent can they maybe be a commitment, so they can maybe outline a commitment, but if they're not followed up by concrete action that actually questions, as Tess was also saying, the power structures behind that, they're not going to lead to much change just by writing down these words.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. I think I just want to ask you as well, Bontu, because you represent also CBS's diversity and difference platform. Just to quickly jump back to the terminology, what are your thoughts on using diversity, for example?
I think it's similar to what has been said before, that it can be super useful to getting people on board with those conversations. But we're definitely also within the platform then critically questioning, for example, what if diversity is then seen as something you can kind of assign to subjects? So then you bring in a Black person or queer person, and they're the person who's supposed to make the organization diverse, which then in the end only recenters a norm around whiteness, about being straight and cis that is not questioned. And so I think those things need to be questioned, and we also use this terminology to ask those questions. So for example, with inclusion and tolerance, we sometimes have this exercise with our students where we ask them to walk around in a room and walk up to a person and tell them, I tolerate you for wearing a blue t-shirt, for example. And it feels really weird to everyone involved because, the person who's being tolerated suddenly realizes, who are you in the first place to tell me that you tolerate me? Because it shows exactly that power hierarchy that Tess was also describing, about one person or one group being in charge of deciding who is included and tolerated, and on what terms. So we do use the terminology, but also to kind of critically question what we mean by it and what it allows us to do and what not.
Okay, interesting. So you actually use the term tolerance in your work?
To not necessarily in my work, but for example, with students, to then have them question why it's maybe not a term that really allows us to question the norms and structures that we want to question. So kind of, instead of going in and saying, these are the terms you can use and these are the terms that you cannot use, we use the terms that are in use in order to question them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Ulrike, I know that you've worked with sort of organizations from a few different sectors, so leaders in business, but also teachers, for example. What are your thoughts on this? For example, the box ticking. Can you see this as more common in certain sectors?
Ticking the box, like now we have written this brilliant policy, work is done. Is that the question?
Yeah, for example, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of difference. And then again, there's a lot of similarities as well in organizations. And I think it takes some time often for organizations to realize how much work needs to be done if they really in depth mean it, if they really want to create more equal opportunities. And often organizations think that this can be a quick fix. We can just hire Rege or one of her colleagues and to give 1 or 2 workshops and then work is done. And it's of course not like this. This is not like you can create a certificate and then do that. But I think that it's possible to explain to them after 1 or 2 workshops that this is continuous work. We have to work on ourselves. They have to work on their organization and keep on working. I forgot the question, sorry.
About box ticking. But yeah, I think this continuous work is coming back for all of us as well. Yeah. Sabrina, did you put your hand up?
Yeah, exactly. Can I add just I think this is where it gets really interesting, that I've been lucky enough to both, engage some in Tess's research that I find very compelling, and also to work with Rege. And one of the common denominators, I think it's called, is that they try to move away from what I call diversity talks and projects, where you either, like Bontu also explained very eloquently before, people have all these talks and all these paragraphs and written down procedures, nothing happens, or people have projects, which is in a limited time frame, where they decide to include someone and use their power to gracefully open their door for somewhat time period. And what really needs to be done is work, continuous hard work. And while that's easy, or at least in my experience, it's easier to advocate for this in research, it's actually kind of hard to get the clients to do, because they would prefer quick fix, right? They like the talks and projects. So how do you sell the work, if you get my point?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something we'll come back to as well in the second section about how to do continuous work with organizations. But before that, I just want to move as well to something that I've spoken to you about, Alex, in terms of also zooming in on the LGBTQ inclusion focus of this event. Because I know that you've raised the question, who is included and who's sidelined in this inclusion work, both in terms of, for example, a broader intersectional perspective of race and class and body type, but also I thought we could talk specifically about within this LGBTQ plus acronym. Could you maybe expand on this a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm recognizing, I'm seeing more and more, is that a lot of the LGBT plus community, especially the ones who also often will use the word queer about themselves, are trying their very best to partake in various different conversations about the axes that feed into the acronym, but also other kind of minority statuses or positions, but also realizing that that it's just the amount of work that feeds into it, not only to deal with the minority stress that you might experience yourself, but also how you're positioning within the acronym. And for example, I am a non-binary trans person, and that is very often my starting point, and it is very often what I'm asked to talk about. But I am also white, I'm also able-bodied, I am also from a middle-class background and have been so fortunate to get a degree that was, for most intents and purposes, was free and paid for by the state. So there's like all of these axes of being part of a minoritized group, while also recognizing that there are so many other places where my privilege feed into me having a platform to talk about this. And then I think the idea of coming into a place where you have to question your own sort of position and realizing that you are also part of the structures that position yourself in a place of privilege, and having to do that sort of work is really difficult. And I find sometimes that within the community that will create division, and you'll have people who almost pin themselves against each other, or who question each other's place of experience. That makes for a really difficult conversation, because we tend to be distinguished by the letters that make us part of a minority, while forgetting that we also are very often, to very different degrees, part of the majority.
Yeah, very important point, and which I think really shows also the complexity of this topic. Thank you for that. And I can see there's also audience questions rolling in. So I thought we'd move on to sort of set the framework in this second section that I've talked about, and then we'll go on to the audience questions. But yeah, all very brilliant, important points that you've raised. But then, yeah, the second section would be about looking at, okay, what are the things that we should keep on doing or start doing instead? And what have you seen in your work that actually works, or hopefully works? And because we all, in some way or other teach or consult and question in order to try and help these organizations is that we work with turn like a critical eye on themselves and change discriminatory structures. And we obviously want this to have like a long-lasting effect and lead to actual change, but that's often easier said than done. For example, when all you get is a theme day or a 2-hour workshop, like some of you have also already mentioned. But Sabrina, I thought I could start with you. What are your experiences of what is actually needed for change to happen in an organization?
Well, first of all, it's kind of hard to answer because often when the work finally is going well, you are kicked out as a consultant, right? Because they don't need you anymore. So to finish it off and follow up and evaluate, I find that very hard. Often other consultants are then hired in to check up on your work, in my experience, which is something completely, it's in the industry, I know, not diversity oriented, but that is a problem, I find. However, when it comes to what works, I've actually found that what's most important is to create maybe not a safe space, but just there being some kind of expert, whether it's a researcher doing a talk or a consultant, that makes themselves available. I often find that people will run up to me in the breaks. They'll contact me, hours or days after I left the building and share their experiences and say, please, what do I do? How do I navigate this? Showing that there actually is a need for some very concrete tools and to start engaging with these people who actually offer themselves up, right? It's people who already have too much homework, I call it. They have extra things to think about simply because of their marginalization. To somehow start there and say, what do they need? And then not pointing them out to their bosses unless they wish to be, starting there, basically, because there's so much we can do, I find.
Yeah, thank you. I know that you, Bontu, have been a part of developing this Gender Lab project through CBS and also in collaboration with Quinfo, and you focus a lot on co-creation in this. What are your sort of takeaways from this project and of what has had an impact, and have you also been able to follow up on the organizations that you have worked with?
Yeah, I think it came out of a similar kind of frustration or a need with, not just wanting to do a 2-hour session and then pretending the problem is solved and nothing happens afterwards. So what we try to do in these workshops is that we combine, on the one hand side, non-critical workshop methodology with design thinking. So what I mean by that is, how we try to do that is that in the first block, we kind of really zoom in on what is the problem here and how does it go beyond an individualized idea of, we're all a bit biased. So what? But we actually look into the structures, the social political structures, the historical structures that recreate those power structures and those norms. And then we look at how's that linked to your workplace? Where do you see that playing out in your everyday working life? And that's then where the design thinking aspects come in super handy. So it's those methodologies of working very creatively, action-oriented on particular solution ideas that could work in that organizational space, and thinking about which resources do we need, who needs to be involved, why can it, for example, not only be the people who are directly implicated by it, but on which power levels do we need people involved. So we try to go beyond just recognizing the problem and becoming aware, but both linking it to the broader structures and then linking it very concretely to your workplace. Where does that play out, and how can you hopefully come out of that training with very concrete starting points on what the next point of action needs to be. So we always try to highlight that this can only be a first step and then more work needs to follow. And then, as you also asked about that, also try to check in with them in intervals and see, what has been implemented, what not, where were the problems, what do we need to rethink. So that's how we've been trying to address that.
Yeah, great. Rike, I know that you've done a long-term project with teachers before. Were there certain things that you could see when you had this chance to work for a longer period of time in terms of what works or what had an impact? Or
Yes, absolutely. Because I also did some diversity labs with in collaboration with Quinfo, so I very much agree on what Bontu just said. But I had the great pleasure to be part of this really long-term, in-depth project with some partners that knows that this never stops. They just started the work. And I think time is very much needed because you need to start. If you haven't been in academia, like many of us, for 5 years studying Judith Butler, Sarah Ahmed, then your starting point is another, and you need some time both to understand the theory, but also very much to link it to your practice, to your everyday. And I think the good thing about this project was that we had many workshops with the different employee groups. And the workshop was a combination of more theory, but also many tasks that they had to do in their everyday life. They had to do a lot of self-observation, video filming themselves, and then afterwards seeing it. And this was in many cases where it became really concrete to them. How are we being discriminatory? When are we being sexist? How are we racist? So the self-observation method. But of course, first you have people to buy in, to accept that we are all discriminatory assholes. That is just first step, and then you can start work.
Yeah, okay. But then a lot of self-reflection throughout the process. Yeah, Alex, I know that at LGBT Denmark you have this certification program, and I know that that's not your, perhaps not your specialty, no, but maybe you have some thoughts to share anyway on, I just think it's interesting to explore this idea of certification. Is it something that you're finished with, or how can you incorporate this continuous perspective? Do you have anything to?
I think the certification was the one that went with the Empatisk Arbejdsmarked. So I think I don't work with that. It's not my primary focus. But I think in general, personally, I'm not a big fan of certificates, because I don't believe that those are a long-term solution, and I recognize that it feeds into the idea of wanting to buy the program that will secure your I'd say image sometimes, rather than the actual work that you put into it. But that's not necessarily a reflection of what the organization is about. But I think so much of the work that I'm doing anyways is about the continuous conversation and recognizing that language is changing, and the way we understand things are changing, and the way that specific marginalized groups want to address issues, or how they talk about themselves, or the language they're asking the majority to use when talking about them. That sort of work, to me, it's way more valuable, but also that much more difficult, because it is asking people to not only take the work that, or the words that they have learned from society, but also recognizing that you cannot necessarily trust an organization like LGBT Plus Denmark, who is constantly evolving and is evolving very drastically right now. So the work that we maybe sent out 5 or 10 years ago is not necessarily representative of the things that we do now. So it's, for me, I think a lot of the things that work is to continuously have the conversation, and the difficult conversations about language and new ideas, because these are areas where things are changing rapidly.
Yeah, thank you. And especially also the point about sort of continuously deconstructing, I think is something that we all try and work with constantly. Yeah. Tess, you've done quite a bit of media consulting, I understand. What are your thoughts on this? Where do you see that going, and what do you see works best in there in terms of moving things forward and actually tackling structural discrimination?
The media industry is really interesting, because the industry is sort of marked by having both to think about discrimination and representation within the organization, but also having to think about it in terms of their products. There's usually a very big output in the media industry, and I do see this in the advertising industry as well, even in corporate communication for most other industries. So I have a background in corporate consulting, and it sort of translates very easily to working with the media industry, I find. I think what I see working, I'm always talking about what doesn't work because I'm a very killjoy-esque person. I think what I do see potential in is founding your work on, for instance, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So you take a human rights-based approach that has a real structural system in place for how to respect human rights, and therefore you would automatically have to think about anti-discrimination because not being discriminated against is a human right. So that sort of founds it in a bigger, more structural system that's been proven over years, and which also most big businesses in Denmark are required to live up to anyway. So it sort of fits with their present due diligence and code of conduct processes. I also found a lot of potential in the design justice principles, which are sort of emphasizing the design process and sort of resituating power and knowledge with those who actually have lived experience of discrimination. So I always say it's a warning sign if the diversity consultants or the anti-discrimination consultants you're hiring don't have like lived experience with the kinds of discrimination that you're interested in looking at, and you should be looking at more than one axis. Another good sign, another sign that you're going down the right path is that you're working multi-axis, which means across multi-axes of oppression, not just gender, not just sexuality, not just class, not just race. And you should be working on multi-levels as well, which is also what Bantu mentioned before, across levels of the organization. And then, of course, I say steer clear of the fluff words, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Actually talk about what matters, racism, discrimination, and inequality. And then, research does show that minoritized folks tend to have a better eye for discrimination. They'll have an easier time identifying. So obviously, the people who experience minoritization and othering in your organization are going to be able to identify this a lot better than most others would. But in order for you to actually take advantage of that, if you are in an organization, you have to be very wary of not contributing to their minority taxation. This is also linked to what Alex called minority stress before. If you are one of very few minorities in your organization, you're likely to be taxed with a lot of extra work, writing up diversity programs or doing diversity events or hiring somebody or planning something or making some kind of diversity initiative. And usually this type of work doesn't go very well rewarded, and it doesn't contribute to sort of growth within the organization. So don't tax your employees, but recognize that if they're minoritized, they will have a better understanding of this. So reward it properly, pay it properly.
Great final words. I think we'll move on to the audience questions. We have 3 that I thought we'd highlight. One from the Facebook chat. They're writing, I find this issue with words/terms and the power issue also very interesting and also difficult in practice. How can you articulate goals without using the criticized terms? I find that we would end up talking a lot about what we want to avoid instead of what we want to obtain. Is there anyone who feels like they want to speak on that? Just put your hand up. Yeah, Sabrina?
I've already said so much, so if anybody else want to go first, I'm happy to take a back seat. I'll start.
Well, you go first. Yeah.
Well, I find it very inspiring to read someone called Karen Ashcraft and her situation-based approach, which is basically, instead of saying, now we're going to eradicate homophobia or we're going to take out racism of the organization, start with a very concrete situation that you know people are going to find themselves in, like your meetings culture. And how is it that you do meetings? And doing what Rikke also talked to when working with the pedagogues and teachers and so on, make them self-observe, let them see who is taking up the space in that meeting or who is asked what in what way. That would often be enough. So if you start with people contacting you as a consultant and they say, hey, please help us with our sexual harassment, maybe start saying, do you know where it happens? Is it part of recruiting? Is it part of the evaluation? Who gets bumped up to C-level directors or whatever? Often the answer will be yes to all of it. But if you do this situation-based approach, maybe there's also an opening to go more in the direction that Tess is talking about with human rights, instead of simply talking about we need more people of color, or we need more women, or we need more LGBT plus persons in this room, to actually look at what's happening in specific situations.
Okay, yeah. Anyone else? Tess?
Yeah, I think this is from years back of being a CSR consultant. We always talk about the difference between doing no harm and doing good. And I really understand that I feel like the question is driving us towards wanting to do good. So why can't we set positive goals or dream bigger or really want something positive for the organization? And I think it's important that before we start thinking about how we can do good or how we can set goals that sort of ring positive or make us feel like we're moving in the right direction, we need to begin by limiting harm. And limiting harm also means we can't start doing empowering, fun diversity work until we've actually thought about discrimination. And we really shouldn't be recruiting an increase of diversity or whatever that is if we don't have an organization that can sustain that can retain those employees and that can treat them properly.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll move on to the second question, so we can take them all. Through mail, we got a person saying, thanks for a fascinating session. If there's time, could the panelists please say a bit more about norm-critical approaches? This seems to be an approach which is common in Scandinavia, but I've rarely heard the term in the UK. Are norm-critical approaches taking place elsewhere under different names? And I thought maybe, Bontu, you wanted to answer that, perhaps?
Yeah, really good point. I'm actually not sure if there's particular other terms that are used in other contexts, so the others are very welcome to help me out with that one. But how we use it or what we mean by it when we work with it in the workshops that we developed is that instead of looking at an individual level and asking, for example, what is the bias that I have as a person, as an individual, we're looking at a structural level and we're trying to understand what are kind of the power structures that allow or that reproduce those biases. And I think what the word norm or norm critical really highlights is how those two levels are always linked. So my individual behavior is always implicated by the organizational, societal, historical structures that I live in and that I work in. And at the same time, my reproducing of that, my action lead to those norms to continuously exist. So it's kind of this idea that you are being critical towards these norms that are often invisible, unquestioned, instead of just kind of the individual outcomes on an individual level. And I think that's really what we're trying to focus on in the workshops, where we use that as a methodology of questioning, so to say.
Thank you for that explanation. And I know that also at CBS, you're producing work that's actually using this term as well, if this person perhaps wanted to read more in English in academic papers. The next question I thought we'd move on to is directed at Rikke. Somebody saying, as a teacher, I would love to hear more from Rikke on her experience working with teachers on a long-term project. Was this at a primary school or a high school? And thank you for a great discussion.
This was in Fredensborg Kommune, in the two cities Kokkedal and Fredensborg, which are two of the four cities. And it was a project that was initiated from the kind of the bottom, meaning that it was not in the Kommunekontor that they came up with the project. It was some of the leaders, for the teachers' leaders, that was searching money for this on their own. They got funding, so we started this really in-depth project, and then we got all the participants on board.
Thank you for that explanation. Alex, you spoke on language before, so maybe you want to answer this question. If not, just pass it on. But somebody's writing via mail. Hi, my question is on the umbrella term LGBTQI plus or LGBTQIA plus, and the risk of excluding queer people who don't feel comfortable with any sexuality/gender categories, or queer people whose category isn't included in the acronym. Do you have any preferred umbrella term? I myself use queer in my work, but know that this isn't uncontroversial. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. How do we name our community, and should we name it?
That's such a good question. I think with the term queer, which has changed meaning over the time, like it started being a slur against primarily cis gay men, to coming into like an academic sort of setting and going into the kind of work that feeds into to feminist studies and then queer studies on its own, and then to something that points towards somebody's gender identity, and then sort of looping back into talking about sexual preference and sexuality and gender as well, while also recognizing that queer in itself was somebody who was, or something that was odd or outside of whatever norm. I think for me that feeds back into the question of which norms are we pointing towards, and what are we interested in sort of highlighting about ourselves or about the work that we do, and the sort of point of view that we come from. So I'd say I know people who personally don't like the word queer, don't identify with the word queer anymore, because it's sort of all encapsulating, and therefore also maybe losing meaning, or potentially it now includes people who wouldn't necessarily be considered queer, say 10 or 15 years ago. So for me, it's not necessarily so much a question of whether or not you can take that word upon yourself. I think if that makes sense for you, then potentially do it. But there's something I think, as we talked about before, and as Tess pointed out, that we have to remember the multiple axes that are at place here, and that which makes you queer, say potentially your sexuality, does not necessarily mean that you are then excluded from other parts of society because you happen to be a majoritized person, because of your weight, because of your skin color, because of your rights to healthcare, because you have papers, you are a citizen in Denmark, whatever. Like, there's so many different axes that we could go about here. So I think it's one of those questions that there's no one answer. I personally very often talk about LGBTQI plus people, and then I refer to people who also then refer to themselves as queer. But it could be, I'd say, either or, depending on the conversation, and specifically depending on which norms we're trying to point out or criticize. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We have about 4 minutes left, so I thought we would round up, even though I'd love to continue forever. But in 30 seconds, if you could wrap up what the main message that you would like the audience to take away from this talk today is. And we will do it alphabetically again. So Alex, 30 seconds.
Wow. I think one of the things that I'm really fascinated about right now is how language is evolving, and obviously it's happening really fast, and some of it is happening from a academic or institutional level, and the other thing is something that is growing out of community and community-based conversations. And I, for one, think that academia is really important, but more so, I would say, listen to the people who are minoritized and who are talking about their experiences, because very often that is what is going to feed into academia at some point.
Super, thank you. Bontu?
I think maybe the point that I mainly take from this talk is what a lot of people said here in the panel about, we need to continue doing the work and we need to continue kind of struggle together. And I'm at the moment super inspired by ideas around solidarity across difference, from Black feminists and post-colonial feminists, thinking this idea of solidarity being a commitment to continuously work on it and struggle with it and try to move forward somehow and do that together. So I think I'm taking that from this round and would like to bring it forward. Let's show up and continuously work on this. That's the only way to really go about it.
Thank you. Rie? I think your sound is turned off.
– Sorry. Okay,
That's
I'll do
okay.
it even quicker. I think it's so important that we continue to be really, really kind, loving mirrors to each other, serve as kind mirrors to each others, because we all have to be self-observing and trying to improve all the time, try to get rid of all these discriminatory norms that we are part of and that we are continuing until we learn how to stop. So let's try to stay serving as kind mirrors.
Thank you. Sabrina?
Well, it's hard to follow up on the three such eloquent, quick points. I guess mine would be what I'm mostly focused on myself is how can we take this very valuable criticism, this killjoy energy that we need in order to disrupt the current norms and the way exclusion, marginalization, racism, homophobia, anti-queerness is going on. How to take that criticism and combine it with constructive approaches. And I believe we have to be aware that we're going to fail, but maybe be more aware of how we want to fail. We can't solve everything right now, but maybe we can take 2 steps forward and 1 step back and be more aware which kind of step we are prepared to take back, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And Tess, final words.
Yeah, I think my final word is just that I think it's also important to know when to step back, when not to take space, when not to take up power, when to critique yourself as an organization as well. As most of the people here today probably have something to do with queer organizations, as most of us do, and most of us identify as queer. It's important, I think, that we think about homo-nationalism and how we can accidentally come to contribute to other forms of oppression if we only think about our own minoritized group. So I think it's important that we do those layered types of approaches, and I think that's the most important takeaway.
Great. Thank you. And thank you so much. What a great way to start this Winter Pride Week. I hope that all of you in the audience got as much from this talk as I did, and all of you in the panel. If you have any feedback or any further questions, feel free to email me at elin@normconsulting.dk. But yeah, thanks again to this brilliant panel. I'm so happy that you wanted to join this conversation. Fantastic points that I think a lot of people will mull over and go home and think more about. And thank you to Copenhagen Pride for this platform. And last but not least, thank you all at home for watching us today. Bye.